A man loses his wife, 3 children are dying, and his farm is on the verge of collapse. That's not the worst of it. The worst is when he reaches out to save a woman ostracized by the town, a woman the whole world has turned its back on. People call her the curse. They say he's crazy. But no one knows that this woman, considered useless, is the only thing standing between his family and total destruction. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't leave, because you don't know what awaits you at the end of this journey. The morning Silas Creed drove his wagon into Harlan's Crossing, the temperature had already dropped to the kind of cold that made your teeth ache even with your mouth closed. It was the kind of cold that settles into wood and leather and bone and doesn't leave until April. And even then, it argues about it. The sky was the color of dirty pewter, low and pressing down on the pine ridgeline like it had somewhere to be and couldn't wait for anyone. The mules were blowing steam from their nostrils in long, ragged puffs, and the smaller one, the gray one Silas called Pepper, had been favoring her left foreleg since the creek crossing 2 miles back. He didn't stop to check the leg. He couldn't afford the time. The wagon bed held 11 empty feed sacks and a short list scratched on brown paper in Silas's own handwriting. Letters that leaned too far to the right because he'd never had much schooling, but he made them legible by habit. Cornmeal, salt pork, coffee if the price was reasonable, wire for the lower fence section, sulfur powder if anyone had it. He'd left the ranch at first light, before the children were awake, because he didn't want to answer questions about why he was going alone, or when he'd be back, or whether he'd bring something sweet. He had nothing left to bring that was sweet. That had been true for 7 months since Clara died. He didn't let himself think the word died too long. He'd discovered early on that thinking it too directly was like pressing a thumb into a bruise. It would stop hurting if you gave it long enough alone, but you had to give it alone. So he pushed it down the way you push a fence post into frozen ground, one hard strike at a time, and moved forward because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still was not something the ranch permitted. Harlan's Crossing was not a large settlement. It occupied a shallow valley between 2 ridges of pine and scrub oak, bisected by a single main road that turned to mud from October through March and dried to a cracked pale hardpan in July. There were 14 permanent structures, if you counted the livery, which Silas always did because the livery had the only working forge for 30 miles, and that made it important. A general store, a land office that doubled as the town's informal courthouse when occasion demanded, a barber who also pulled teeth, 2 saloons, one respectable and one less so, a schoolhouse that served 4 grades simultaneously with a teacher named Miss Alderton who was 19 years old and frequently overwhelmed. It was not a cruel place exactly. Silas had never thought of it that way. But it was the kind of place where people watched each other closely, because there was little else to watch, and because in isolated country the behavior of your neighbors affected your survival in real and immediate ways. Gossip was not entertainment here. It was information. Who was struggling, who was drinking, whose fences were falling, whose wife had taken ill. All of it mattered, all of it traveled, and the line between concern and judgment was thinner than people admitted. He tied the mules outside Granger's general store and went in. The bell above the door announced him with a bright, cheerful sound that felt completely wrong for the weather. Harold Granger was behind the counter, weighing out dried beans for a woman Silas recognized as Ruth Ellison from the Ellison homestead to the north. They both looked up. Ruth gave him a small nod and looked away. Harold said, "Morning, Creed. Didn't expect you before spring thaw." "Road held," Silas said. He moved to the counter and put his list down. Harold read it with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd been reading supply lists his whole life, moving his lips slightly, one finger tracking the words. "Got most of this," he said. "Sulfur powder's been out since November. Wire. I got smooth wire. You need barbed?" "Barbed. Then you're looking at Hedderly's. He keeps a spool or 2. "I'll go to Hedderly's after." Harold started pulling items from the shelves behind him, and Silas stood at the counter and watched the street through the front window because it gave him something to look at. The cold had kept most people inside. A dog was investigating something near the mouth of the alley between the saloon and the land office. A man Silas didn't recognize was sitting on the hardware store steps with his collar up, smoking, looking at nothing. Then the noise started. It came from the direction of the alley. Not the dog, but voices. More than two, less than 10, male voices pitched in that particular register that Silas had learned to recognize over a lifetime of watching men behave badly when they thought numbers were on their side. Not shouting yet. The worst kind, controlled and contemptuous. The way voices sound when the person using them believes they have every right to say what they're saying. He stayed at the window. A woman came backward out of the alley. She stumbled when she cleared the alley mouth, one foot catching the uneven ground where the boards ended and the frozen mud began, and she went down hard on one knee. She had a bundle pressed against her chest, cloth of some kind tied with a rope, the kind of bundle a person carries when they have nothing bigger to carry things in. Her coat was too thin for the weather, brown wool that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and pale at the elbows. Her hair was dark, and she'd pinned it up, but the fall had knocked some of it loose and it hung at the side of her face. 3 men followed her out. Silas recognized 2 of them. The third was the man from the hardware store steps, who'd moved faster than he'd looked capable of. "Nobody's stopping you from going," one of the men, Vernon Pyle, who ran the less respectable saloon, was saying. His voice was pleasant, which made it worse. "Just move along. Harlan's Crossing doesn't need what you're selling." The woman said something. Silas couldn't hear it through the window glass. "We don't care where you go," Pyle said. "We care that it's away from here." She was trying to stand. One hand on the ground, the bundle shifted to the other arm. She got halfway up, and Silas saw her face for the first time, turned toward the men, not away from them, which surprised him. Not young, not old, maybe 35, maybe less. Features that would have been unremarkable, except that they were arranged into an expression he'd seen before and recognized immediately. The face of someone who has been humiliated so many times that they've passed through anger and shame and come out the other side into something quieter and more durable. Not defiance, exactly, more like endurance. The expression of a person who has learned that fighting back uses energy they cannot spare. Pyle reached out and knocked the bundle out of her arms. It wasn't a violent gesture. He did it almost casually, the way you'd brush something off a countertop. But the bundle hit the ground and split, and the contents, a spare dress, a small tin box, some folded papers, scattered across the frozen mud in front of her. She crouched to gather them. Silas was already at the door. He was outside before he'd made a conscious decision to be, the cold hitting him like a wall, and he was crossing the street at a pace that was not quite a run, but left no doubt about his destination. "Creed?" Harold Granger called from the doorway behind him. "Don't!" He didn't slow down. He stepped between the woman and Vernon Pyle with about a foot of clearance on either side. He was not a small man, 6'2", carrying the kind of physical weight that came from 2 decades of ranch labor, shoulders that had pulled fence posts and thrown feed sacks and lifted calves out of mud, hands that had been broken twice and healed crooked. He didn't touch anyone. He just put himself where he was, which was enough. Pyle took a half step back and then looked annoyed at himself for doing it. "Creed," he said, "this doesn't concern you." "You knocked her things down," Silas said. "She was told to move on. Pick them up." A beat of silence. "She's trouble," Pyle said, and his voice had hardened. "You don't know who she is. She rolled through here 6 weeks ago, asking for work, and we told her then, Harlan's Crossing isn't hiring her kind. She keeps coming back. Woman like that, people start to talk, and I'm not letting her drag this town's name through." "Pick up her things," Silas said. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't feel the need to. Pyle's jaw tightened. He was not a coward, but he was also a man who understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic of 3 against 1 looked different when the one was Silas Creed than it did against most men. He looked at the woman's scattered belongings on the ground. Then he looked at Silas. Then he did a small, contemptuous thing with his mouth and walked away, and the other 2 men went with him. Silas turned around. The woman had gathered most of her things by herself. She was tucking the last folded paper back into the bundle, her movements quick and efficient, not looking at him. He crouched down and picked up the tin box, which had rolled to his boot, and held it out. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and she was clearly cold. The words came out slightly rougher than they would have otherwise. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "That appears to be the question," she said. He stood up. She stood up. They were roughly the same height standing, which was unusual enough that he registered it. Up close, he could see the cold had put color into her cheekbones, and her lips were chapped, and she had the look of someone who hadn't slept somewhere warm in a while. What did you do? He asked. To make them run you out. She looked at him steadily. I exist, she said. Apparently that was enough. Her name was Evelyn Cross, and he got the story in pieces over the next hour, partly from her and partly from Harold Granger, who told him things he hadn't asked about while he was loading his supplies into the wagon, the way people in small towns do when they know something and can't quite decide whether to spread it or keep it. She'd come through 6 weeks prior, on foot, carrying everything she owned. She'd said she was a widow, looking for domestic work, cooking, cleaning, anything honest. She'd been turned down by every household in Harlan's Crossing inside of 3 days. The reasons given ranged from polite to insulting. They didn't need help. They had enough help. She seemed healthy enough to manage on her own. They'd heard things. What they'd heard, apparently, was that she'd come from a town 2 days east called Fallow Ridge, where she had been married to a man named Gideon Cross, and where something bad had happened that nobody could agree on the details of. Some version had her running off. Some version had her husband running her off. Some version involved accusations that Silas didn't put much stock in, because accusations in frontier gossip almost always multiplied in the telling and bore little resemblance to origin by the time they arrived. What Harold Granger said, low-voiced and with more disapproval than he probably intended to show, was, "The woman has a reputation, Creed. I'm not saying it's deserved. I'm saying it's there." "What kind of reputation?" Silas asked. "Trouble follows her kind," Harold said. "People don't trust it. You can't ask folks around here to take a chance on someone like that when times are already thin." "Times are always thin," Silas said. He found Evelyn Cross sitting on the wagon bench outside, waiting. He hadn't told her to wait. She'd just done it. "You have anywhere to go?" he asked her. "Not presently," she said. He looked at the mule team, then at the Pine Ridge line, then at the sky, which had gone from pewter to a slightly darker pewter that suggested snow before nightfall. "I've got a ranch 6 miles north," he said. 3 kids, no help, a sick livestock situation, and a kitchen that hasn't been used properly since October. I'm not in a position to pay much, but there's a room, meals, and I don't throw people's things in the mud." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it honestly because she'd asked it honestly. "Because I need the help," he said. "And you clearly do too. That seems like enough." She looked at him for a long time in the way of someone trying to find the trick. He didn't blame her for looking. "All right," she said finally. The ranch was called Creed's Hollow, though Silas had never been the one to name it that. Clara had, in the first year, looking at the way the land dipped down between 2 long rises of timber, and said it looked like a hollow someone had pressed into the earth with their thumb. The name had stuck the way names do when someone says them with enough certainty. It was 240 acres, which sounded like a lot, until you knew how much of it was too rocky to plow, too steep to graze, or too wet in spring to be reliable. The workable land was closer to 80 acres, of which maybe 50 was decent pasture. He ran cattle, had run cattle, present tense felt optimistic, and kept chickens, 2 pigs, a kitchen garden in summer, and a small orchard of 4 apple trees that Clara had planted the year before she got sick, and which had produced exactly 1 useful harvest before the blight hit. The house itself was solid. He'd built it himself over 2 seasons before the children came, adding to it as the family grew. A main room with a large stone fireplace, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that was the best investment he'd ever made, 3 small bedrooms, a front porch that tilted slightly to the left because he'd gotten the post placement wrong on the north side and had never fixed it. Clara had covered the tilt by putting a planter box on the porch rail that had to be shimmied with a folded feed sack on the low side, and the sack was still there. He tried to see it as Evelyn would see it as they came down the track from the road. Neglected was the honest word. The woodpile by the door was dangerously low. The kitchen garden fence had a section down where one of the cattle had pushed through it in November, and he hadn't repaired it. The chicken coop needed new bedding. The curtains in the main room window, Clara's curtains, the blue ones, were still up but had gone gray with smoke and dust, and one of them had a tear along the bottom that he'd been meaning to deal with for 4 months. The smoke from the chimney was thin, which meant the fire inside was barely going, which meant the children were managing it themselves, which meant he needed to have another conversation with Thomas about putting wood on before the coals went to ash. He pulled up in front of the house, and the door opened almost immediately. Thomas came out first. He was 11 years old and had Clara's light coloring and a gap between his front teeth that he'd gotten from Silas's side of the family. Silas had the same gap, just less noticeable now because he was older and the surrounding teeth had settled. Thomas was wearing his coat, which was good, but he'd left it unbuttoned, which was Thomas in a nutshell. Nearly right, not quite there. Behind him came June, who was 8, who had stopped in the doorway and was looking at the wagon and at the woman on the bench beside Silas with an expression of open-faced curiosity that she had inherited from no one identifiable. It was just hers. "Who's that?" Thomas said. "Her name's Evelyn Cross," Silas said, climbing down from the bench. "She's going to help out around here for a while." "Help how?" Thomas said. "All the ways that need helping," Silas said. From inside the house, he heard coughing, the kind that came in waves and didn't fully stop between them. He looked at Evelyn briefly, and she was already looking at the door, her expression having changed into something focused and assessing. "That your youngest?" she asked. "Millie," he said. "She's 5. She's been sick since—" He stopped. "She's been sick." Evelyn climbed down from the wagon without waiting to be helped, which he noted but didn't comment on. She smoothed her coat and looked at Thomas. "Is she inside?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said, slightly automatic. "Is she in bed or up?" "She was up earlier. She gets mad when you make her stay in bed." Evelyn almost smiled at that. He could see it start and then get controlled. "Smart girl," she said. "But sick girls need to be in bed. Who's been taking care of her?" Thomas pointed at himself. Evelyn looked at him, really looked, in a way that Silas noticed was different from how most adults looked at children, which was slightly above and slightly absent. She looked at him the way you'd look at someone you were taking seriously. "How old are you?" 11. "That's a lot of responsibility," she said, not pitying, just direct. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said again, and something in his face relaxed slightly, as if he'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge that and hadn't known it. Evelyn went inside. Silas followed. June had backed away from the doorway and was now standing in the center of the main room, still watching with that open-faced curiosity, next to a chair where Millie was huddled under a quilt that had slid halfway off her, her small body shaking with the effort of suppressing another cough that came out anyway. Millie was small even for 5, with dark eyes that she'd gotten from Clara's mother, and a stubbornness that she'd gotten from Silas or Clara, or possibly both. It was impossible to attribute. She looked at the strange woman who had walked into her house and did not look uncertain about it. She looked suspicious, which was different and more intelligent. "Who are you?" Millie said. "Evelyn," the woman said. She was already crouching to Millie's level, which again Silas noticed, because most adults didn't bother. "How long have you been coughing?" "A while," Millie said. "Does your chest hurt when you cough?" "Sometimes." "Can you take a deep breath for me?" Millie tried. The breath hitched partway in and turned into another cough, and her face went red with the effort of it, and Silas watched Evelyn's expression and could see her filing information the way a person files it, who knows what to do with it. "Do you have mustard?" Evelyn asked, turning to look at Silas. "In the kitchen," he said. "Probably." "And lard?" "Yes." "Vinegar?" "I think so." "Then go find them, please," she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. He went into the kitchen and started looking through the shelves, and he could hear behind him the low sound of Evelyn talking to Millie. Not the words exactly, but the tone. Even, unhurried, the kind of voice that makes children stop bracing for something bad. He found the mustard powder behind a jar of dried beans. The lard was in a tin near the stove. The vinegar was harder. He had to move 3 things to get to it. And by the time he brought all 3 back into the main room, Evelyn had Millie back in bed, which was the bedroom off the main room that the 2 girls shared, and had found a cloth from somewhere, his own kitchen rag, he'd see it later, and was explaining to June, who had followed at her heels, what she was going to do and why. "The mustard draws the heat to the chest," she was telling June. "It gets the blood moving and helps break up what's sitting in there. You have to watch the time, though, because if you leave it too long, it burns the skin." "How do you know when it's too long?" June asked. 12 minutes, Evelyn said. "No more." "Can you count to 60? "I can count to 100, June said, with the particular dignity of a second child who has been underestimated before. Then you can count 1260s, Evelyn said. I'll need you to do that while I keep the cloth warm. June squared her shoulders and nodded. Silas stood in the doorway and watched this happen. He'd lived in this house for 11 years. He'd built it with his hands and filled it and managed it through drought and bad market years and a winter that killed half his cattle and the death of his wife and 7 months of trying to hold everything together by himself. He knew every board and beam and fault in the place. But watching Evelyn Cross move through it in the first hour, finding what she needed, organizing what she found, talking to his children like they were people worth talking to, he had the vertiginous feeling of a man who has been bailing a leaking boat alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone hand him a better bucket. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was something more complicated than comfort, but it was something. The first week was not smooth. He hadn't expected smooth, but the specific ways it was not smooth were different from what he'd anticipated. The children were not the problem. Thomas was cautious and watchful in the way of a boy who had been the man of the house for 7 months and wasn't sure how to stop being that, but he was not unfriendly, and within 2 days he was telling Evelyn things about the ranch, where the tools were kept, which of the cattle had which temperament, the particular stubbornness of the pump handle in cold weather, and the careful, slightly official tone of someone passing on authority. June took to her immediately, which didn't surprise Silas because June had always had that quality of immediate attachment, and the question was never whether she'd take to someone, but whether it was reciprocated, and Evelyn reciprocated. Millie's chest improved by the 3rd day, which created its own problem because Millie recovered from the illness and then turned her full, unimpaired stubbornness toward the project of testing Evelyn's limits and finding out what she was made of. Millie did this to everyone. She'd done it to Silas's brother, to the minister who'd come by after Clara died, to the woman from down the valley who'd brought food twice and then stopped coming. The test was different each time, but the goal was the same. Find the place where the person flinched. With Evelyn, Millie refused to eat her supper on day 4, just sat in front of it with her arms crossed and her chin forward. Silas waited for Evelyn to cajole or negotiate or threaten, which was the usual response. Evelyn looked at the bowl, then at Millie. Then she picked up her own spoon and ate her supper in silence. When she was done, she stood up, removed Millie's bowl from the table, covered it with a cloth, and said, "It'll be there if you want it later." And then she started washing the other dishes. Millie stared at her retreating back for a full 30 seconds. "That's my supper," she said. "I know," Evelyn said from the wash basin. "You can't take my supper." "I didn't take it," Evelyn said. "I set it aside. You're welcome to eat it whenever you'd like. I'm not going to argue with you about it." Another 30 seconds. "What if I'm hungry later?" Millie demanded. "Then you'll eat it later," Evelyn said pleasantly. Millie ate her supper cold 20 minutes later, with the careful dignity of someone who had decided to eat voluntarily and not because of any external pressure whatsoever. Evelyn did not comment on this. She was already doing something else. After that, Millie watched Evelyn with a different quality of attention, still suspicious, but assessing rather than adversarial. The real problem, was the work. There was too much of it, and Silas hadn't fully calculated how much until he saw someone else taking it on. Evelyn was up before him every morning. He'd hear the stove being loaded from his bedroom and come out to find the kitchen already warm and coffee already made. And he had the disorienting experience every morning of reaching for a problem he'd been carrying for months and finding it already handled. The house was cleaner by the end of the first week than it had been in a year. Not clean in an ornamental way, he'd have found that uncomfortable, but clean in a functional way, the kind of clean where you knew where things were and nothing smelled wrong, and the surfaces were clear enough to work on. Small changes that accumulated, the curtains taken down and beaten and rehung, the smoke and dust beaten out of them so that the blue came back. The porch sack replaced with a proper shim, cut to size. He didn't ask how she'd found the tools or known the porch tilted. She'd just noticed. The livestock was harder. He kept her away from the barn those first days. Not from any rule, just from an instinct about letting a person settle into one thing before adding another. But on the 4th morning, he found her standing at the fence of the cattle pen in the gray early light, forearms on the top rail, looking at the animals the way you look at animals when you know them. "How many did you lose?" she asked without turning around. "4 last winter, 2 more in the fall. How many do you have now?" 7. Down from 15. She was quiet for a moment. 2 of those 7 are thin, she said. I know. What are you feeding them? What I have, he said. It came out more tired than he intended. She turned from the fence and looked at him, and he expected the look that people gave you when things were bad and they didn't know what to say. A softening around the eyes, a quick look away. She didn't do that. Prairie hay's no good in December, she said. They need something with more to it. Do you have any dried beet pulp, anything like that? I can try to get it from Hetterly's. Do, she said. Also the smaller one, the one with the notched ear. She's got something in her left front foot. You'll want to look at it before it spreads. He checked the notch-eared cow's foot that afternoon. There was a stone wedged under the frog, deep enough to be causing pressure. He'd been watching her gait and knowing something was off, and hadn't had the time to stop and examine it carefully. He got the stone out with a pick, and she was walking easier by evening. He stood in the barn after and thought about that, about the specific practical intelligence of someone who had learned hard things by necessity and carried that knowledge forward. He thought about what Harold Granger had said, trouble follows her kind. He thought about the way she'd been backing out of that alley, one knee coming down in the mud, trying to hold on to her things. He drove back into Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks after he'd first brought her home, for the wire he still needed and a few other supplies. He went alone in the early morning because there was no particular reason to bring anyone and the children had school. The feeling of the town had shifted, not dramatically, but he felt it the way you feel a change in weather. Something in the air, in the way people's eyes tracked him differently. Martha Alderton from the Post stopped him in the street before he'd gotten to Granger's. I heard you took that woman in, she said. Hired her, Silas said. There's a difference. Is there? Martha said. He looked at her. Martha Alderton was not a bad woman. She was a widow herself, and she ran the Post with efficiency, and nobody gave her trouble about it, and she'd been one of the people who brought food after Clara died. She was also someone who understood, instinctively and completely, how reputation functioned in a place like Harlan's Crossing, because her own depended on it. I needed help, he said. She needed work. I don't know what else there is to say about it. People will talk, Martha said. They already are. Let them, he said, and moved on. He heard more of it at Granger's, where Harold gave him the wire and the cornmeal and said nothing about Evelyn directly, but said it in the spaces between the things he did say, in the careful, considerate way of a man who liked Silas and wanted him to understand the stakes without having to be explicit about them. You're a respected man around here, Creed, Harold said, handing over the change. People have thought well of you, even after Clara passed. They've been rooting for you. That's kind, Silas said. What I mean, Harold said, is you've got something to protect. I've got 3 kids and a failing ranch, Silas said. That's what I've got to protect. I'll protect it the best way I know how. He loaded his wagon and drove home through a sky that was finally, tentatively, beginning to show some blue. The first real trouble came on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a delegation, which was too grand a word for 3 men riding up the track to the house on a cold morning, but that was what it amounted to. Reverend Harold Fitch, whose title came from a self-conferred ordination that nobody had ever formally questioned. Damon Reeves, who ran the land office and was the closest thing Harlan's Crossing had to an official, and Vernon Pyle, who had apparently decided that his business with the alley was not yet finished. Silas heard the horses and came out onto the porch before they'd tied up. He stood with his arms loose at his sides and his hat on, watching them tie. Creed, Damon Reeves said. He had a politician's instinct for leading with his own name rather than the other person's, as if establishing territory. We'd like to speak with you. You're speaking, Silas said. Inside would be better. This is fine, Silas said. They exchanged a look. Reeves and Fitch, the way men exchange looks when they've agreed on something beforehand and are now checking whether the agreement still holds. Pyle looked at the front of the house with naked curiosity. Reeves cleared his throat. We're concerned, he said, about the situation. This woman you've taken in. I haven't taken her in, Silas said. I employed her. She works here. Yes, well. Reeves folded his hands in front of him, the gesture of a man moderating something. Living arrangements of that nature, with a man who has no wife, it creates an impression. People talk. So I've heard, Silas said. It's not just talk, Fitch said. He was a narrow man with strong opinions that he wore visibly on his face at all times. There are children in that house, impressionable children, and this woman has a history, Creed. You don't know what you've brought home. What history? Silas said. Fitch opened his mouth. Specifically, Silas said, not what people say. What you know. Fitch closed his mouth. I know what I've observed, Silas said, which is a woman who has worked from before sunup to after sundown every day for 2 weeks, who got my youngest daughter over a chest illness without the doctor because there was no doctor available, who has treated my children with more patience and good sense than most adults I know. If you've got something specific to tell me, I'll listen to it. If it's just the general sense that people are talking, then I've already heard that, and I don't have any different answer for it now. Pyle had been quiet, which was unusual for him. He spoke now, and his voice was less pleasant than it had been in the alley, which probably meant he was being more honest. The woman's a widow out of Fallow Ridge, he said. Her husband's dead, and the story around how he died isn't clean. I'm not saying she's a murderer. I'm saying the story isn't clean. What story? Silas said. It's not... Pyle stopped. I don't have the full details. Then maybe, Silas said, you should get the full details before you ride out to a man's property to tell him who to hire and who not to. The three of them looked at him. He looked back at them. The wind came across the open yard between the house and the fence and lifted some dry grass blades and dropped them again. We're asking you, Reeves said finally, to think about what you're doing to your standing in this community and to your children's standing. I think about my children's standing every day, Silas said. Mostly I think about whether they're fed and warm and growing up with the understanding that a person deserves to be judged on what they do and not on what somebody somewhere heard about them. He paused. I appreciate the concern, I do. But my answer's the same. He went back inside. He heard the horses eventually moving away back toward the road. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She had been there the whole time. He'd been aware of her presence behind the wall, the way you're aware of a person just off stage. He didn't know how much she'd heard through the window, but from the way she was holding herself, very straight, hands flat on the counter, looking at the wall in front of her, he thought probably most of it. You know, she said quietly without turning around, you could make your life significantly easier. Probably, he said. I could be on the road before noon, she said. I've done it before. I'm good at it by now. I know you are, he said. I'm asking you not to. She turned then, slowly, and looked at him. Something in her expression was working at restraint, which he recognized because he spent a lot of time doing the same thing. Why? She asked, and it was the same question she'd asked in Harlan's Crossing, outside Granger's store. But it wasn't the same question. That one had been about safety, about checking whether there was a trick. This one was different. This one was asking something she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Because you're good at what you do, he said, and my children need somebody good at what they do. And as far as I can tell, what those men said out there has no bearing on any of that. She looked at him for a long moment. It isn't just men talking, she said at last. You should know that. There are things I'm not going to explain to you today, maybe not for a long time, that are more complicated than what those men said. I'm not a simple situation to take on. I figured that out, he said. And I've got 3 kids and 7 cattle and 40 acres of frozen pasture and a fence that still needs barbed wire on the lower section, he said. I don't have a simple situation to offer you either. She let out a breath. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was the closest thing to one he'd seen from her. Fair enough, she said. She turned back to the counter and he heard the knife start moving again through vegetables, even and rhythmic, and the kitchen smelled like something good that had been simmering, and outside the blue patches in the sky had grown and the cold had pulled back slightly. Not enough to matter, but enough to notice. He went out to check on the notch-eared cow. He did not let himself think about the look on her face when she'd said, I'm not a simple situation. He filed it the way he filed other things, down under the immediate demands, where it would wait. But it waited. By the end of February, the ranch had changed enough that he could see it without trying, the way you can see color coming back into something that was gray. The kitchen garden fence was repaired and reinforced. The woodpile was deep and stacked in the order that kept it driest. which was a method he hadn't known before, and which Evelyn had shown Thomas without making it seem like instruction. The two thin cattle had put on weight. Millie's cough was gone entirely, and she had taken to following Evelyn around with the sustained scientific persistence that she'd previously reserved for following the barn cat. June had declared, with the matter-of-fact authority of an 8-year-old making a formal announcement, that Evelyn made better biscuits than anyone she had ever known. Thomas had taken to asking Evelyn questions about the land, not deferring to her, just talking, the kind of practical, direct conversation between two people who both care about something and have useful things to say. Silas watched this happen and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 7 months, which was the specific warmth of a house being inhabited by people who were talking to each other. He caught himself watching her sometimes and stopped himself. He was aware of the precariousness of that, the way grief made you want to fill the shape it left, the way loneliness was its own kind of hunger and equally difficult to think clearly around. He was careful about it. He kept his distance. He was respectful. What he did allow himself to observe, because it was pertinent and not anything else, was competence. The specific, unshowy competence of someone who had learned everything they knew because circumstances had required it, and not because anyone had made it easy for them. She'd grown up in difficult conditions. He'd gathered that much, not from what she said, but from what she was capable of, and how she moved through the work, with the economy of motion of someone who had never had the luxury of waste. She could read, which not everyone could, and she did it with the quiet pleasure of someone who'd taught herself and valued it precisely because of that. He'd found her one evening reading to Millie and June from the almanac, of all things, making it sound like a story. The migration patterns of birds, the names of stars, the cycles of the moon. Her voice low and unhurried while the girls lay in their bed and let it carry them toward sleep. He'd stood in the hallway and listened longer than he should have. The community hadn't stopped talking. He heard it on his trips to Harlan's Crossing, caught in the spaces of conversations that stopped when he walked up or shifted in his presence. Martha Alderton at the Post gave him a look every time that managed to communicate concern, disapproval, and a desire to say something without being the one to say it. He understood that his position in the community was being quietly renegotiated, the way it always was when a person did something the community hadn't endorsed, and he understood what that cost. He decided he could afford it. That was the thought he had on a late February morning, riding the fence line on the north pasture with the light coming flat and gold across the snow-thinned grass. The air carrying that particular smell that was not quite spring but was not entirely winter either. He could afford it. He had what he needed, which was 3 children who were doing better than they had been, and a ranch that was pulling back from the edge. Whatever the community of Harlan's Crossing thought of his choices was information he would register and carry, because you couldn't live in a place and ignore the people in it. But he was not going to sacrifice something that was working because the alternative was easier. He pulled up on the fence line and looked back toward the house, visible in the distance. The porch, the chimney smoke, rising straight in the still air, the kitchen garden fence neat and repaired, the washing on the line that meant Evelyn was working, which she always was. He thought, the stranger no one wanted. He thought, they didn't know what they were turning away. He sat his horse on the fence line and let the thin late winter light come down on him, and he did not allow himself any conclusions about what that meant or what it might eventually require him to do. It was enough, for now, to simply know it. He rode back down toward the ranch, and the smoke rose straight above the chimney, and somewhere inside the house a door opened and he heard, faintly, the sound of Millie's voice asking something, and Evelyn's voice answering, and then a small burst of laughter from both of them that carried out across the cold air and reached him before he'd made it back to the gate. He didn't stop riding, but he held on to that sound the way you hold on to something that costs nothing and is worth everything. March came in like something that had been held back too long and was now making up for it, all mud and melt and the constant drip of snow coming off the roof in the afternoon sun, freezing again by nightfall into long clear teeth along the eave edge. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Creed's Hollow swelled and turned brown with runoff, and 2 of the lower fence posts that Silas had been meaning to reset since November finally gave way entirely and had to be dealt with before the cattle found the gap, which they did anyway, because cattle have an instinct for the exact moment a fence fails and a talent for being there when it happens. Silas spent 3 days in the mud resetting those posts, and on the second day Evelyn came out with Thomas and worked alongside them, not asking whether she should, just appearing with the post maul and a level, and the understanding that 3 sets of hands was better than 2. Thomas had grown several inches since fall and was discovering the complicated pride of being almost strong enough to do things. He could swing them all, but not with the sustained force that drove a post true, and Evelyn had spotted this without comment and taken up the slack without making it obvious she was doing so. By the 3rd day, the fence was reset and solid, and Silas was standing at the gate watching Evelyn show Thomas how to tamp the base fill properly, packing the earth in layers rather than all at once. And Thomas was listening with the concentrated attention he gave to things he'd decided mattered. "You learned fencing?" Silas asked her. Later, when Thomas had gone back to the house. "Among other things," she said. She was pulling off her work gloves, which were his spare pair, 2 sizes too large. "My father kept goats. Different fencing, but the principle's the same." "Where was that?" he asked. She looked at him briefly. "East of here," she said. Not unfriendly. It was just the amount she was giving, and he'd learned to read the difference between what she offered and what she was keeping back, and not to push at the keeping back part. "All right," he said. She handed him the gloves and went back to the house, and he folded them over the fence rail and stood in the late March mud and thought about how little he actually knew about her, and how that seemed, against all sensible advice, to be shrinking as a concern rather than growing. Spring declared itself properly in the first week of April, the way it does on the frontier, not gradually, but in a sudden, almost aggressive burst of green, as if the land had been waiting with impatience and could no longer contain itself. The pasture grass came in faster than Silas had seen it in 3 years. The kitchen garden, which Evelyn had spent 2 weeks preparing, turning the soil, working in compost from the barn pile, raking the beds level and marking the rows with stakes and string, went in on an April morning when the ground had dried enough to work and the air smelled like everything wet drying in the sun. June helped with the planting, crouched beside Evelyn in the dirt with her dress already beyond saving by the second row, dropping seeds into the holes Evelyn made with her finger at intervals that June counted aloud because Evelyn had asked her to. Millie helped for approximately 20 minutes before deciding that the barn cat was doing something more interesting and leaving without announcement. Thomas dug the deeper beds for the root vegetables with a spade, steady and methodical, pausing occasionally to look at the layout Evelyn had sketched on brown paper and pinned to the fence post for reference. "You plant beans next to squash," Thomas said at one point, not challenging, just noticing. "They help each other," Evelyn said. "The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which the squash likes, and the squash leaves shade the ground so the beans don't dry out as fast." Thomas absorbed this. "Pa always planted them separate," he said. "It's not the only way," Evelyn said. "It's just one way that works well." Thomas looked at the layout again. "Whose way is it?" "My mother's," she said, and then she moved to the next row, and Thomas didn't follow up on it, which was the right instinct. Silas had noticed that his son was developing the useful human skill of recognizing when a door had been opened a crack and closed again, and leaving it alone. The cattle were doing better. The 2 thin ones had put on weight through March, and the notch-eared cow, whose name had somehow become Nellie, assigned by Millie, with the unilateral authority of a 5-year-old, had gone back to full production and showed no further sign of the foot trouble. Silas had gotten 4 additional hens from Hedderly's in exchange for fence work, and the egg count had improved enough that Evelyn had started doing things in the kitchen that he hadn't tasted since Clara was alive. Cornbread, with a crust that shattered when you broke it. Dried apple pie from the last of the stored apples. A bean soup that simmered for hours and had a depth to it that he couldn't account for and didn't ask about because asking felt like it might make it stop. The children were eating well. That was what he registered first every morning. That they were eating and eating enough, and doing so at a table that had someone at its head who made the meal a thing worth sitting down for. He'd caught himself on more than one occasion sitting at that table after the children had gone to bed, drinking his coffee while Evelyn finished the last of the kitchen work, and just talking. Not about anything significant, not at first. The cattle, the garden. Whether the southeast field was worth trying to plow this year, or whether the drainage was still too poor. Practical conversation between 2 people who shared a set of problems and were thinking through them together. But it accumulated, that kind of talking. It built up into a thing that had more weight than any individual conversation accounted for. One evening in late April, she told him, unprompted, about the goats. Her father had kept 12 of them on a rocky hillside in a county she named that Silas had heard of but never been to, and she'd been in charge of them from the time she was 8 years old because her father's hands had gone bad with some joint condition that made cold weather a torment. She talked about it matter-of-factly, the way people talk about things that were hard, but also just what they were. No self-pity, no particular drama, just the texture of it, the details that she still carried, the way the goats sounded before a storm, the weight of the milk pails, a particular animal she'd been fond of that had died of snakebite one summer when she was 11. He told her about learning to build the house, the mistakes he'd made, the things Clara had told him were wrong that he'd argued about and then fixed when she was proven right, the post on the porch, the way he'd gotten the chimney proportion wrong the first time and had to tear it down and rebuild it. He hadn't talked about Clara to anyone since the funeral, not at length, not with any texture, and it came out stiffly at first, the way something comes out of a joint that has been locked too long. But Evelyn listened without performing her listening, without the careful softening around the eyes that people did when they thought they were supposed to show you that the subject was sacred. She just listened, and that somehow made it easier. "She sounds like she was practical," Evelyn said when he described the chimney argument. "She was," he said. "She was the most practical person I ever knew, except maybe—" He stopped. "Except maybe?" she said. He picked up his coffee mug. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with the expression she used when she'd caught something and was deciding whether to pull on it. She let it go. He was grateful. Ian. The trouble in town had not resolved itself. He'd been hoping, without much conviction, that the winter complaints would dissolve in the practical concerns of spring, that people would find something more urgent to focus on. Instead, it seemed to have solidified. He heard it from Thomas first, which was the worst possible way to hear it. His son came home from school on a Wednesday in early May with a particular quality of silence that Silas had learned to recognize. Not the regular silence of a boy who was tired, but the loaded silence of one who was deciding something. They were doing the evening chores together, Thomas pitching hay while Silas checked the water trough. When Thomas said, without looking up from the pitching, "Ned Reeves told me today that Evelyn is running a scheme on you," Silas straightened up. "Ned Reeves is 11 years old." "I know that," Thomas said. He was still pitching, methodical. "He said his father said it, that she's planning to work herself into the house so she can take claim of it when you don't notice." "That's not how land claims work," Silas said. "I told him that." Thomas paused. "He didn't care." "What did you do?" Thomas finally looked up. He had a bruise developing under his left eye that Silas had noticed when he came home but hadn't yet addressed. "I pushed him," Thomas said, "and then he hit me. And then we both got in trouble." Silas looked at his son. The bruise, the set of his jaw, the way he was standing, that particular combination of having done something he wasn't entirely sorry for and being old enough to know that it had costs. "Pushing people doesn't fix what they think," Silas said. "No," Thomas said, "but it stops them saying it to your face." He couldn't argue with the logic, even though he probably should have. He put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder and left it there for a moment and then took it away. "The things people say about Evelyn come from not knowing her," he said. "There's not much we can do about that except keep doing what we're doing." "Is that enough?" Thomas asked. It was a question Silas didn't fully have an answer to. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's what I've got." Thomas nodded slowly and went back to the pitching. He had the look of someone who found the answer insufficient but was going to work with it anyway, which was, Silas thought, about as much as you could ask of a person. He didn't tell Evelyn about the conversation with Thomas, but he thought she probably knew anyway, in the way she seemed to know things about the children, registering small changes in temperature before anyone had announced the weather. The formal pressure came a week later when Damon Reeves rode out again, alone this time, in the late afternoon. Silas was in the barn, and Evelyn was on the porch, sitting in the evening light with a pile of mending, which was how Reeves found her. A woman alone on the porch of a man's house in the early evening, which was exactly the kind of image that Reeves had been building his case on. Silas came out of the barn when he heard the horse and found them already in conversation, or what passed for one. Reeves talking in his measured land office voice, and Evelyn looking up at him from the mending with an expression that Silas had privately categorized as the controlled one, where the surface was perfectly still because what was underneath it was not. "Miss Cross," Reeves was saying, "I don't think anyone in Harlan's Crossing bears you personal ill will. I want to make that clear. The concern is for the family, for what it looks like." "And what does it look like?" Evelyn said. "A woman living on a widower's property without—" "I work here," Evelyn said. "I have a room in the house that has a door with a latch. I cook and clean and manage the livestock and look after 3 children who were in worse shape when I arrived than they are now. What part of that concerns the community?" Reeves heard Silas's step and turned. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Creed," he said. "Reeves," Silas said. "I was explaining to Miss Cross—" "I heard what you were explaining," Silas said. He came up to the porch and stopped at the bottom step, which put him at eye level with Reeves on horseback. "Same thing you explained to me in February. My answer's the same." Reeves looked at him steadily. He was a man who believed he was acting in the community's interest, and that belief made him persistent in a way that simple malice wouldn't have. "People are talking about removing their custom from your ranch," he said. "If you're looking to sell any cattle this season, you'll find the market in Harlan's Crossing less receptive than it was." The silence that followed had weight to it. Silas felt it land. The cattle market in Harlan's Crossing was not the only market available to him, but it was the nearest and the most reliable, and Reeves knew that. It was not a threat that had been issued carelessly. "I appreciate you telling me directly," Silas said after a moment. "That's at least honest." Reeves gave a short nod, turned his horse, and rode back down the track. Silas stood on the porch steps and watched him go. Behind him, he heard the mending resume, the small, precise sound of a needle pulling thread. He didn't turn around. "I can leave," Evelyn said quietly. "If it comes to your cattle, I can leave." "You said that in February," he said. "I meant it in February. I know you did." He finally turned around. She was looking at the mending in her lap, not at him, her jaw set in the particular way it set when she was making herself stay still. "I mean, what I've been saying since February, too," he said. "Nothing's changed." She looked up then. The evening light was doing something to her face that he registered and didn't examine. "Your children's lives," she said. "Your standing, your cattle market, that's not nothing." "No," he said, "it's not." He sat down on the top step. "But I've been making decisions based on what I can see in front of me. And in front of me is a ranch that's running again and 3 kids who are doing better than they were. The rest of it—" He stopped. "The rest of it is people being frightened of something they don't understand. I've never been good at making decisions based on that." She was quiet for a long time. The light was going gold and then pink off to the west, and the first insects of the evening were starting. "You are a strange man, Silas Creed," she said. "Probably," he said. She went back to the mending. He sat on the step. Neither of them said anything else, and somehow the silence was more settled than the conversation had been. The specific quiet of 2 people who have said the hard things and arrived, temporarily at least, at the same place. May moved through them the way good months sometimes do on the frontier, busily, with the work of it constantly at hand so that you registered it passing without having time to watch it go. The garden came in strong. The bean rows were thick and healthy, the squash vines spreading wide, the root vegetables showing their tops in neat lines. The apple trees, Clara's 4 apple trees, bloomed in the 2nd week of May, which they hadn't done properly in 2 years, and Evelyn noticed and said nothing about it for several days, just looked at them when she passed, until Millie asked why the trees were wearing flowers, and Evelyn told her that the trees were getting ready to make something good, and Millie had stood under the branches with her arms out and let the petals fall on her coat and decided this was the best thing that had happened in recent memory. June had taken to spending her afternoons with Evelyn in whatever Evelyn was doing, carrying things, asking questions, absorbing information with the steady appetite of a child who has found someone worth learning from. She had started using phrases that were Evelyn's, small habits of speech picked up unconsciously. "That'll do when something was finished. Let's see it properly when something needed examining." Silas heard these and felt something complicated and warm. Millie had stopped testing Evelyn. This had not happened because Evelyn had won some confrontation or established dominance. It had happened, as far as Silas could determine, because Millie had run the experiment to completion and received her answer. Evelyn did not flinch. She did not negotiate from a position of wanting to be liked. She was consistent, which was the thing Millie could not break, and the thing that ultimately she most needed. Silas had woken one morning in early May and come out to find Millie sitting in Evelyn's lap in the kitchen chair while Evelyn read to her from the almanac, the same almanac she'd read from to both girls at night, the bird migrations, and the star names. Millie had her fingers in her mouth and her eyes half closed, and Evelyn was reading in her low, unhurried voice, and neither of them had heard Silas in the doorway, and he had stood there long enough to be certain of what he was seeing and then gone back to his room to give them the morning. He stood in his room in the gray, early light and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and held it there for a moment. He thought, "This is not something I planned for." He thought, "This is not something I know how to handle carefully enough." He got dressed and went to do the morning chores and did not return to the thought for the rest of the day, which was the only management strategy he had. The full weight of the community's opinion arrived in June when the ladies of Harlan's Crossing decided, collectively and with the authority of a body that had never been formally constituted but operated as though it had, that Evelyn Cross should be directly addressed. Silas heard about it from Thomas, who heard about it from Ned Reeves, who had apparently been present when his mother and 3 other women discussed it at the general store. The group of them had agreed to come to Creed's Hollow on a Saturday and speak with Evelyn alone, meaning without Silas present, to explain to her the position she was placing a decent widower and his children in, and to encourage her, strongly, to find other arrangements. He told Evelyn. She was standing at the stove when he told her, and she didn't turn around. She kept stirring whatever was in the pot. "When?" she said. "Saturday," he said. "You don't have to see them." "If I don't see them, they'll say I'm hiding," she said. "If you do see them, they'll say what they came to say." "They'll say it either way," she said. She set down the spoon and turned around. Her expression was the controlled one again, but underneath it was something tired, not defeated, just tired in the way of someone who has been having the same argument with the world for a very long time and is worn down by the consistency of it. "Let them come," she said. "I'd rather hear it straight." He started to say something and stopped. "You can't be there," she said. "That'll only make it worse." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Do you trust me to handle it?" "Yes," he said immediately, and she looked slightly startled by the immediacy, and he was slightly startled by it too, the way it had come out without deliberation, already certain. Saturday arrived, and with it, Martha Alderton, a woman named Frances Holt, whose husband ran the grain storage, Reeves's wife, Eleanor, and a 4th woman, Judith Pyle, Vernon's wife, who had the look of someone who had been mildly reluctant but had come anyway because not coming would have required an explanation. Silas took the children into the far pasture with a manufactured errand, fence checking, which always needed doing, and stayed there for the better part of 2 hours. When he came back with 3 children who were muddy and hungry and wanted to know why they'd checked the same fence section twice, the women were gone, and Evelyn was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting there long enough to go cold. He sent the children to wash up. He sat down across from her. "How was it?" he said. "About how I expected," she said. "What did they say?" She looked at the cold coffee. "That I'm doing harm to the children by being here. That I'm a woman of uncertain history in a position that will only lead to gossip and damage. That my continued presence is an insult to your wife's memory." She said all of it flatly, as if reading from a list, and that I should have enough decency to remove myself before I ruin anything else. He didn't say anything for a moment. "What did you say?" he asked. She was quiet. "I thanked them for coming," she said. And then, after a pause, "And then I told them that I would take their concerns under consideration." He looked at her. "Which I will," she said. "I am." She met his eyes and held them, and her own were doing something difficult and careful. "Silas, they're not entirely wrong about what they're saying. Not about my intentions. They are wrong about that. But about the position you're in. About what it costs you. They're not inventing that." "I know they're not," he said. "Then you understand why I have to think about it seriously," she said. I understand why you think you have to, he said, and I understand that I can't tell you not to. You'll make your own decision. He folded his hands on the table. But I'd like to say something before you do. She waited. What you have done here, he said, slowly, because he was not a man who found these words easy, and he was going to get them right anyway. In 4 months, what you've done for this ranch and for my children, for Millie especially, and you know that, that's not nothing that can be weighed against community opinion and come up short. I won't pretend those things don't have weight. They do, but so does this. He stopped. So do you. She looked at him for a long time. Something in her face had shifted from the flat, careful control she'd been holding, opened slightly, in the way that something opens when the pressure against it decreases. You are very difficult to argue with, she said quietly. I get that from my father, he said. He was wrong about most things, but he was hard to argue with about all of them. She made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh again. He was collecting those. I'm not leaving, she said. Not today. That's all I was asking for, he said. Today. She got up and poured the cold coffee out and started a fresh pot, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and outside the June afternoon was doing what June afternoons did, long and golden and slow. And the children were coming down from upstairs in the staggered way they always did, Millie first and loudest, and everything was still uncertain in all the ways that it had been. But she was still there, and she was staying, at least through the evening, at least through the meal, at least through the cool June dark that was settling over Creed's Hollow like something gentle that had learned to stay. He got up to call the children for supper and did not let himself look at her again for the rest of the evening, because there were limits to what he could manage carefully, and he was approaching them. The summer settled over Creed's Hollow, the way good summers do when you've been afraid to count on one, carefully, as if it knew it was on probation. The garden produced past what Silas had expected. The cattle filled out. The apple trees, having bloomed in May with that extravagance that had made Millie hold out her arms, were now heavy with small, hard fruit that would be ready by September, and every time Silas walked past them he thought about Clara planting them, and then, more recently, about Evelyn looking at them in silence for several days before saying anything, and the two thoughts had stopped feeling like they were in conflict with each other, which was something he hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely know what to do with. He and Evelyn had reached an arrangement that neither of them had formally named. Not a truce exactly. They'd never been in opposition. More like a working understanding between two people who had decided, separately and without discussion, that the ground between them was solid enough to stand on and that standing on it was preferable to the alternative. They talked in the evenings. They worked together through the days in the way of people who have learned each other's patterns and stopped needing to negotiate the small things. She knew he took his coffee without sugar and preferred the barn work done before breakfast rather than after. He knew she got quiet when something was wrong rather than louder, and that quiet required space and not questions. He knew she read by the window on Sunday evenings, if she had the time, and that this was the closest thing to rest she allowed herself. The children had stopped treating her like a visitor. That was the clearest marker, and it had happened so gradually that Silas couldn't point to a specific day. One morning, Millie was calling her Evelyn with the possessive inflection that children use for things that belong to them. And June was asking her opinion on things the way you ask someone whose answer you've already decided to trust. And Thomas was doing the specific thing that Thomas did when he respected someone, which was to argue with them about practical matters and then do it their way and pretend he'd decided that himself. July was good. Hot, but the kind of hot that made the evening sweeter. When the temperature dropped fast and the air came through the windows carrying the smell of the pasture grass and the creek, and they would sit on the porch sometimes after the children were in bed, not always talking, just sitting in the way of people who are comfortable enough with each other to be quiet. He had not said anything about what he felt. He was aware that he felt it, had been aware for some time, but the awareness and the saying of it were separated by a distance he didn't know how to cross without risking things he couldn't afford to risk. She was in a complicated position. She had made it clear, in the way she made things clear without stating them directly, that she was grateful for the work, and the roof, and the children, but that gratitude was not the same as something else. And he was not a man who wanted to collapse those two things into one and find out later he'd been wrong about which one he was standing on. So he said nothing. He sat on the porch and watched the dark come down over the pasture and he said nothing, and she sat in the other chair, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, and that was, for the moment, what he had. August arrived, and with it a drought that dried the creek to a trickle and turned the pasture grass brittle at the tips and made the water hauling a daily emergency. The garden needed hand watering, which was an hour's work morning and evening with the bucket brigades that Evelyn organized with military practicality, assigning Thomas the heavy hauling and June the careful work at the root beds, and herself the squash and beans that were furthest from the well. Millie hauled one bucket at a time with both hands and spilled approximately half of each one on herself and was enormously pleased about her contribution. The drought broke in the third week of August, with 3 days of rain that turned the yard to mud and swelled the creek again and left the pasture smelling like everything wet and alive. When it was over, the apple trees were heavier than before, and the garden had put on a last surge of growth that Evelyn said would carry them well into winter if they got the preserving done in time. She said us and we when she talked about the ranch. He noticed. He didn't mention it. It was a Tuesday in the first week of September when the rider came down the track. Silas saw him from the fence line where he was doing the repair work that the post-drought ground settling had made necessary. He straightened up with the wire stretcher in his hand and watched the rider come. Not a familiar horse, not a familiar seat. The man rode deliberately, not in a hurry, in the way of someone who has arrived where he was going and knows it. He was big. Even at 200 yards, Silas could see that, wide through the shoulders, heavy in the saddle, with a dark hat pulled low and a duster that had seen weather. He came down the track at a walk and stopped when he reached the yard fence and looked at the house with an expression Silas couldn't read at that distance. Something in Silas went still. He set the wire stretcher against the post and walked back toward the yard. The man had dismounted by the time Silas reached the fence. He was standing beside his horse with the reins loose in one hand, looking at the house. And now that Silas was closer, he could see the specifics. Somewhere near 40, maybe older, with a jaw that had been broken at some point and healed slightly off-center, pale eyes that had the quality of eyes that have done a lot of watching and a little more than watching. He was wearing a sidearm on his right hip in a way that was not incidental. "This Creed's place," the man said. "It is," Silas said. He stopped at the yard fence between the man and the house. "Who are you?" The man's pale eyes moved from the house to Silas and assessed him in the flat, calculating way that Silas had seen in men who had spent time doing things that required quick assessments of other men. "Name's Gideon Cross," he said. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silas held himself very quiet. "I'm looking for my wife," Gideon Cross said. "I have reason to believe she's here." "You have reason wrong," Silas said. "Do I?" It wasn't a question. Cross's eyes went back to the house. "I've been tracking her for the better part of 3 months. Place called Harlan's Crossing. Folks there were real helpful. Said a rancher named Creed had taken a woman in. Dark hair, around 35, came through in February." He looked back at Silas. "That description fit anybody you know?" "I employ a woman," Silas said carefully. "Her name's Evelyn Cross. She told me she was a widow." Something moved in Gideon Cross's face. Not surprise exactly, more like satisfaction, the expression of a man whose expectation has been confirmed. "She says that," he said. "She's been saying that for years. Gets to be a habit, I suppose, telling a story enough times." He reached into his duster and produced a folded document, held it out. "Marriage record," he said. "County of Fallow Ridge. Gideon Aldous Cross and Evelyn Ruth Marsh, married in the year of 1871. That's 18 years ago. Mr. Creed, not dead, not widowed, just gone." Silas didn't take the document. He looked at it in Cross's hand and then at Cross's face and tried to read what was under the surface of it, not the practiced reasonableness of the voice, but what the voice was covering. "What do you want?" Silas said. "What's mine?" Cross said simply. "She's my wife under the law. Whatever arrangement you've got going here, and I'm not here to make accusations about the nature of it, you understand. I'm a reasonable man. It doesn't change the legal fact. She comes home with me. That's what the law says." "The law also says a man has to treat his wife decently," Silas said. Cross's expression didn't change. "I don't know what she's told you," he said. "I'd take it with some consideration. Evelyn has always had a gift for making herself sympathetic. It's one of her better qualities. He tucked the document back into his duster. I'll give you until tomorrow morning. That's more than fair, I think. Have her ready to travel. He turned and mounted his horse with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, and he rode back up the track at the same deliberate walk he'd come in on, unhurried, certain of his ground. Silas stood at the yard fence and watched him go, and felt the specific cold that settles in when something you knew was coming arrives and is worse than you prepared for. He went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She was at the counter and she was very still, which told him she had heard. The window above the counter faced the yard, and the voices had carried on the dry September air. He didn't say anything right away. He came into the kitchen and stood there, and she had her back to him and both hands flat on the counter, and she was holding herself the way a person holds themselves when they are working very hard at something internal. You knew he might come, Silas said. Not accusing, just stating. I thought he might be dead, she said. There was a fever in Fallow Ridge 2 winters ago. I heard. Someone told me he'd taken ill. A pause. I wanted it to be true. That was a mistake. Wanting something to be true doesn't make it so. How long? He said. She turned around. Her face was stripped of the controlled expression she usually wore when things were hard. It was just her face, without the management, and she looked tired in the way of someone who has been tired for a very long time and has gotten so accustomed to it that they stopped identifying it as tiredness. We married in 1871, she said. I left in 1882. 11 years. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to apologize for leaving. I'm not asking you to, he said. He'll have papers, she said. He always prepares. He's not a stupid man. That's one of the things that makes him dangerous. Stupid men make mistakes you can use. Silas pulled out a chair from the table and sat down. He needed to think, and he thought better sitting. What did he do? He said. I'm not asking to fill in the story. I'm asking because I need to know what we're dealing with. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came to the table and sat down across from him, which she did in a single deliberate movement that had decision in it. The first years were ordinary enough, she said. Or what passed for ordinary. He had a temper, but most men have tempers. It wasn't until the 4th year that it changed. She paused. He broke my wrist, said I'd dropped a lamp carelessly, and he'd lost his temper. Apologized afterward, which he was good at, the apologizing. She said this with no particular emotion, in the same flat register she'd used to describe what the women of Harlan's Crossing had said to her. It became a pattern. Something would happen, or he'd decide something had happened, and then there would be consequences. And then the apology, and then a period of being very careful, and then it would start again. She looked at the table. I stayed because I didn't have anywhere to go, and then I stayed because I told myself it would change, and then I stayed because I was frightened of what would happen if I left. She lifted her eyes. And then one night I decided that being frightened of leaving was less rational than being frightened of staying, so I left. Silas was quiet. The wrist, he said. Is that? It healed wrong, she said. My left hand. It aches in cold weather. She said it without self-pity, just as information. There are other things. I won't list them. All right, he said. He sat with it. Outside, the September afternoon was doing nothing remarkable. The pasture dry and golden, the creek recovered, the apple trees heavy in the distance. Ordinary afternoon on a frontier ranch. He sat with it. He'll go to the law, he said. He already has the law, she said. He had it when I left. That's how it works. A wife is her husband's under the law, whether the husband is good or not. That's not a secret. Her voice was level, but something under it was fraying at the edges. He'll take me back, and there won't be a thing you can do about it legally. And if you try to stop him, he'll find a way to make it costly for you. That's what he does. He finds the thing that costs, and he uses it. What's my thing? Silas said. She looked at him. What does he think he can use against me? Silas said. Your land, she said. He'll claim something. Interference with a legal marriage, harboring a runaway wife. He doesn't need the claims to stick. He needs them to be expensive. Legal proceedings take money and time, and they take it from the person who can least afford to spend it. Silas nodded slowly. That tracked. It was the same mechanism Reeves had used, smaller scale. Find the cost and apply it. If you go with him, Silas said. Don't, she said quickly. I'm not suggesting it, he said. I'm thinking out loud. If you go with him, what happens? She was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she said. He'll be angry. He's been tracking me for 3 months, and I told people he was dead, which makes him look foolish, which he doesn't tolerate. She stopped. Nothing good, she said. That's the honest answer. Silas stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the track and the road beyond. Empty now, cross long gone back toward town. He stood there for a while. Then he turned around. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer it straight. She looked at him. If the legal situation were different, he said, if you were free, would you want to be here? The question sat in the kitchen between them. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Surprise was part of it, and something more guarded and something else underneath that she was working to contain. That's not a useful question, she said carefully, given the situation. I know, he said. I'm asking it anyway. A long silence. The clock on the mantel in the other room ticked through several seconds. Yes, she said. I would want to be here. He nodded once. He turned back to the window. Then here's what I'm thinking, he said. He rode into Harlan's Crossing the next morning before dawn, which was early enough to catch Damon Reeves before the land office opened, which was where he needed to go first. He'd thought through the night, not well, not with the clean clarity of a man who has slept and come to his conclusions fresh, but with the grinding persistence of one who has worried a problem from every angle he can reach and arrived at the only answer that holds. He found Reeves at home, still in his shirt sleeves, with coffee and a look of irritated surprise at the knock on his door before 7. I need to know something about marriage law, Silas said. Specifically about what makes a prior marriage invalid. Reeves looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back and let him in. They sat at Reeves's kitchen table, and Reeves, who, whatever his faults, was genuinely knowledgeable about the legal frameworks that governed the territory, laid out what he knew. A prior marriage could be challenged on grounds of abandonment if a spouse had been absent for a sufficient period without contact and without support. The period varied, but 7 years was commonly cited as the threshold at which abandonment could be legally presumed. Evelyn had been gone from Fallow Ridge for 7 years. It's not automatic, Reeves said carefully. He'd have to be shown to have made no attempt to maintain the marriage. No correspondence, no financial support, no attempt to locate her through legal means. He found her through gossip, Silas said, not through legal means. She's been in this county for 7 months, and there's no record of him filing anything before yesterday. Reeves looked at him. Creed, he said slowly. What are you planning? Nothing yet, Silas said. I'm gathering information. He left Reeves's house and found the lawyer. There was only one lawyer operating in or near Harlan's Crossing, a man named Calvin Price, who had an office above the barber shop and a reputation for being precise and slightly expensive and worth it. Silas had never had occasion to use him. He used him now, sitting across from Price's desk in the small upstairs office that smelled like paper and lamp oil, and laying out the situation with the same directness he used for everything. Price listened without interrupting. When Silas finished, Price was quiet for a moment, tapping a pen against his desk in a rhythm that seemed to be how he thought. The abandonment argument has merit, Price said. 7 years absence, no documented attempts to maintain contact, no legal proceedings filed until now. A judge could find grounds. The question is how quickly we could get a hearing and whether the husband contests it. He paused. He will contest it. I know that, Silas said. Then you're looking at a proceeding that takes time and costs money and isn't certain, Price said. I know that too, Silas said. Price looked at him steadily. There's another option, he said, faster and with different legal standing. Silas waited. If the woman were to remarry, Price said carefully, to someone in this territory, before Cross can get a court to confirm his claim, it creates a conflict of jurisdiction that complicates his position considerably. 2 legal claims on the same person. The territory court would have to sort out precedents, and that takes time. And in the interim, she's not obligated to go anywhere. He paused. It's not a guaranteed solution, it's a complication. But it shifts the burden. Silas sat with that. How much time would it buy? He said. Months at minimum, Price said. Potentially longer if we argue abandonment concurrently. And if the abandonment argument succeeds, he opened his hands, then the prior marriage is void, which makes the new one valid and the whole question resolved. Silas stood up. He put money on Price's desk. I'll be in touch, he said. He rode home. Gideon Cross came back that afternoon, as Silas had expected, and this time he brought Vernon Pyle with him, which told Silas that he'd been working Harlan's Crossing efficiently, finding the local resentments and attaching himself to them. Pyle had been wanting leverage over Silas for months. Cross had given it to him. They stopped at the yard fence. Silas was on the porch. I gave you until morning, Cross said. I heard you, Silas said. It's afternoon. I can see that. Cross looked at the house behind Silas. She in there? Yes, Silas said. Then we've got a problem, Cross said. His voice had lost the reasonable quality it had carried yesterday. This was the voice underneath the reasonable one, and it was harder. You're obstructing the lawful reunion of a man and his wife. I've got a witness. He gestured at Pyle. You can have as many witnesses as you want, Silas said. I'll file obstruction, Cross said. An alienation. You know what alienation of affection costs in this territory? I'll have your land tied up in proceedings before winter. Silas looked at him. Then he looked at Pyle, who had the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who has attached himself to something and is now aware it is heavier than he thought. You want to talk about the law, Silas said. Fine, let's talk about it. 7 years, Cross. 7 years since she left Fallow Ridge. 7 years with no documented contact, no legal proceedings, no attempt to locate her through the courts. You know what the territory law says about that? Cross's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You've got a marriage record from 1871, Silas said. I've got a lawyer who says that record's validity is arguable. We can argue it. Take as long as you need. He held Cross's eyes. Or we can settle it another way. What way? Cross said. The door behind Silas opened. He hadn't told Evelyn to come out. He hadn't told her anything about Price or the legal conversation. Not yet. He heard the door and turned, and she was standing there. She'd heard the voices, same as yesterday, and she'd made her own decision about whether to stay inside. She looked at Gideon Cross across the yard, and the look on her face was not the controlled expression she used for the women of Harlan's Crossing, or for Reeves, or for any of the smaller pressures that had come since February. This was different. This was the look of someone who has spent years being frightened of one specific thing and has finally turned around to face it and found that facing it feels different from everything they expected. Not better, not worse, just different, cleaner. Gideon, she said. Evelyn, he said. His voice had shifted again, taken on something almost gentle, which was worse than the hardness. Come on home. No, she said. A silence. You don't have a choice, he said. She does, Silas said. He turned back to Cross. He had made his decision in the night, and he was going to say it now, in front of Cross and Pyle, and anyone else who needed to hear it. She has a choice because she has a legal standing that didn't exist yesterday. He looked at Evelyn briefly, and she looked back at him, and he needed her to hear this correctly. Not as obligation, not as strategy, but as what it was. If she'll have me, he said, I'm asking Evelyn to marry me. Today, before you can file anything. Ishki. Sakti. The yard went very quiet. Pyle made a sound that was not quite a word. Cross's pale eyes moved from Silas to Evelyn and back to Silas. The reasonable voice was gone entirely. What was underneath it was a cold, contained fury that had the quality of something that had been compressed into a very small space for a very long time. You don't know what you're doing, Cross said. I know exactly what I'm doing, Silas said. Cross looked at Evelyn. You go through with this, he said, and I'll burn every legal avenue I have. I'll tie this ranch in proceedings until there's nothing left. I'll bring witness against witness, and I'll make your life here impossible. You've been making her life impossible for 18 years, Silas said. From a distance, in person, through reputation and rumor and whatever was available. I'm not impressed by the list. Cross's hand moved toward the sidearm on his hip. Not fast, not a draw, just a movement, a reminder. Don't, Silas said quietly. It was one word and it had no heat in it at all, which made it more effective than shouting. Cross's hand stopped. I'll file tomorrow, Cross said. I'll have proceedings open before the week's out. Then we'll see you in court, Silas said. Cross looked at Evelyn one more time. Something went through his face that was complicated and brief, and then was gone, replaced by the cold look that Silas thought was probably his natural resting state. He wheeled his horse and rode up the track. Pyle went after him, not looking back. Silas stood on the porch steps and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded. Then he turned around. Evelyn was standing in the doorway. She was gripping the door frame with one hand, the right one, not the left, the one that had healed wrong, and her face was the one without the management, the plain one, the tired one. You didn't ask me first, she said. I know, he said. I'm sorry. I wanted him to hear it before he could think of a counter-argument. She looked at him for a long moment. You know what this starts, she said. If I say yes, it won't be just talk. He'll come at you with everything he has. I know that, he said. You could lose the ranch, she said. Legal proceedings cost money. He knows that. He's done it before. Price says the abandonment argument runs concurrent, Silas said. He thinks we have grounds. Price doesn't know Gideon, she said. No, Silas said, but I do now. She let go of the door frame. She stood up straight, which was a thing she did when she was about to say something that cost her. You asked me yesterday, she said, if the situation were different, if I'd want to be here. I remember, he said. I answered that question honestly, she said. I want you to know that. What I'm about to say isn't because of the legal situation. It isn't because of him. She held his eyes. It's because it's true. He waited. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. He let out a breath that he'd been holding since yesterday morning without knowing it. It came out ragged, and he didn't try to smooth it. All right, he said. His voice was rougher than he intended. This is going to be very hard, she said. Probably, he said. I need you to know that before... Evelyn, he said. She stopped. I know, he said. I know it's going to be hard. I know he's not finished. I know the town isn't finished, and the legal situation isn't finished, and nothing about this is going to be neat or quick or without cost. He paused. I'm asking you anyway. She looked at him. That look that was hers, the one without the performance of any particular expression, just her face looking at his. Then, let's get it done before he gets to a judge, she said. He went to find Thomas to ask him to watch the girls, and he went to get the wagon, and the September afternoon laid itself out before them, long and golden and full of things that hadn't happened yet, and not a single one of them promised to be easy. He didn't need them to be easy. He just needed them to be. Calvin Price married them that same evening. It was not a ceremony in any sense that the word usually implied. There were no flowers, no gathering of witnesses beyond what the law required, no particular arrangement of the room. Price had a notary seal and the authority to perform civil unions under territorial law, and he used both in the spare, practical manner of a man who understood that what was happening was legal procedure first and everything else second. Silas and Evelyn stood in Price's office above the barber shop while the September evening settled over Harlan's Crossing outside the single window, and they said the words that the law required, and Price recorded it in his ledger with the date and the signatures and the seal, and that was that. Evelyn's hand, when Silas took it for the required portion of the ceremony, was cold. He held it anyway. She didn't pull away. Afterward, standing on the boardwalk outside while Price locked his office, she said, Well, he agreed. She looked up the street toward the saloon, where presumably Gideon Cross was doing what men like Cross did when they were building toward something, drinking just enough to sharpen rather than dull, talking to anyone who'd listen, calculating. The lamps were coming on in the buildings along the main street, yellow squares in the gathering dark. He'll hear about it before morning, she said. Probably, Silas said. Small town. He'll file first thing, she said. Price will be ready, Silas said. I talked to him before I came back to the ranch. He knows what's coming. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you planned quickly. I didn't sleep, he said. She looked at him then, in the lamplight, and something in her expression was softer than her usual registers. Not soft exactly, but open in a way it rarely was, The way a face looks when the guard has come down, not from decision, but from exhaustion. Neither did I, she said. They drove home in the dark. The children were in bed, Thomas still awake and reading by candlelight when Silas looked in on him, and Silas told him briefly what had happened and watched his son process it with the particular care of an 11-year-old who is trying to decide whether he has an opinion on something his father has done. Thomas didn't say much. He said, "Is it going to be all right?" And Silas said, "I think so," which was honest in its imprecision, and Thomas accepted it with a nod and went back to his book, which was itself a kind of acceptance. Silas sat in the kitchen for a long time after the house was quiet. He could hear through the thin wall of the house the small sounds of Evelyn in her room, the creak of the floor, the sound of water in the basin. He sat and drank cold coffee and thought about the week ahead with the methodical grimness of a man walking toward a thing he can't avoid and has decided to walk toward straight. Gideon Cross filed in the morning, as predicted. The filing went to Judge Harlan Wick, who rode circuit through the territory and happened to be scheduled to stop in Harlan's Crossing within the week, a coincidence that Cross had clearly researched before he arrived, because men like Cross did not trust coincidence to work in their favor. They arranged for it. The filing was extensive, a challenge to the validity of the Creed marriage on grounds that Evelyn was already legally married at the time of the ceremony, a claim of interference against Silas, and a separate civil action that alleged, in language that Price described to Silas as creatively constructed, that Silas had induced Evelyn to abandon her lawful husband through financial inducement and improper influence. The last claim was, as Price noted with dry precision, largely without merit. The first two were more complicated. "He's thorough," Price said, reading through the filings in his office while Silas sat across the desk. "I told you he was," Silas said. "The challenge to your marriage is the core of it," Price said. "If he wins that, the rest follows. Our abandonment counterclaim is solid, but solid and successful are not the same thing, and it depends significantly on what evidence he brings about his attempts to maintain the marriage." "He won't have much," Silas said. 7 years. "He'll have something," Price said. "Men like this always have something they held back, kept in reserve. Expect a letter, a single letter, something he can produce. Maybe 2. He was right. Cross produced 3 letters at the hearing, dated across the 7-year period, addressed to Evelyn at the Fallow Ridge address. They were, in Price's assessment after reviewing copies, almost certainly written recently. The paper was too fresh, the ink not aged. But proving that would require an expert in document analysis that they did not have immediate access to, and Price told Silas this with the honesty of a man who does not deal in false reassurance. "We work with what we have," Price said. The hearing was set for Friday, 5 days. Silas used them the way he used difficult periods, by keeping his hands occupied and his mind disciplined to the task immediately in front of him, one fence post at a time, one water trough at a time, and then sitting with Price in the evenings to go through every element of the case that could be prepared in advance. Evelyn spent those 5 days in a state he hadn't seen in her before. Not the controlled quiet she used for stress, but something more active and contained like a current running under glass. She continued the ranch work with the same efficiency as always, perhaps more so, as if movement were the only reliable management tool she had. But he caught her sometimes standing still in a way that was unlike her. At the kitchen window in the early morning, or at the garden fence in the evening, looking at nothing in particular with an expression that was internal and working. He didn't push at it, he gave it space. On Thursday evening, the night before the hearing, she came and sat at the kitchen table while he was going over notes with Price, who had ridden out to do a final preparation session. She sat down without asking if she was interrupting, which she wasn't, and she looked at the papers on the table and then at Price. "He'll say I'm lying," she said, "about everything. That's his pattern. He's very good at it. He's believable." "I know," Price said. "We prepare for that." "He'll have people," she said, "from Fallow Ridge. He travels with influence. Men who owe him. Men he's helped. He'll bring testimony." "So will we," Price said. He looked at Silas. Silas had spent 2 of the 5 days writing to every person in and around Harlan's Crossing who had direct knowledge of Evelyn's work and character. Not the community opinion of her, not the gossip, but the observed reality. He'd talked to Hedderly, who dealt with her directly on the cattle feed, and had found her sharp and honest. He'd talked reluctantly but necessarily to Damon Reeves, who had his own issues with Silas but who was scrupulously accurate under pressure, and who, when Silas laid out what Cross had done in Fallow Ridge, had gone quiet in a way that suggested the information was adjusting something. He'd talked to Harold Granger, and he'd talked to Thomas. That conversation had been the hardest one. He'd sat down with his son the same evening he'd come back from Harlan's Crossing and told him, without softening it into something easier, what was going to happen at the hearing and what Thomas might be asked. His son had listened with the stillness that he used for important things. "He hurt her," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Silas said. Thomas looked at the table. "Is that why she doesn't talk about before?" "Yes." Another silence. "What do you need me to do?" Thomas said. "Just tell the truth," Silas said. "What you've seen, how she's been here. That's all." Thomas nodded once, with the gravity of someone who understands that truth-telling under formal circumstances is a different weight than truth-telling in ordinary ones, and that he is willing to carry it. The land office doubled as the hearing room. It was not large enough for the number of people who came. Silas hadn't anticipated the audience, or perhaps he had, and hadn't fully weighted what it meant. By 9 o'clock on Friday morning, every chair the land office contained was occupied, and people were standing along the walls and in the doorway, and more were outside looking in through the windows. Harlan's Crossing had been talking about Silas Creed and the woman he'd taken in for 7 months. Now they'd come to see the resolution of it. And the resolution had acquired a villain who was not local and a legal drama that was more interesting than anything the settlement had produced in recent memory. Judge Wick was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s who had the quality of a man who has presided over many difficult human situations and been altered by them into something spare and attentive. He sat up at the land office's main desk, arranged his papers with the efficiency of practice, and looked out at the assembled crowd with an expression that communicated clearly that he would tolerate its presence as long as it behaved, and not a moment longer. Cross was already there when Silas and Evelyn arrived, seated at one side of the room with a lawyer Silas didn't recognize, brought in from somewhere else, which spoke to preparation and resources. He didn't look at Evelyn when they entered. He looked at Silas, briefly, with the pale eyes and the fractional tightening of the jaw that Silas had already catalogued as his tell for controlled anger. Evelyn sat beside Silas and Price at the other side. She was wearing her better dress, the dark one, and her hair was up properly, and she sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at Judge Wick. Silas sat beside her and felt the slight pressure of her arm against his and left it there. The hearing opened with Cross's lawyer, whose name was Fetcher, presenting the core claim that Evelyn Ruth Cross, née Marsh, was lawfully married to Gideon Aldous Cross under territorial law that said marriage had not been legally dissolved, and that the subsequent marriage to Silas Creed was therefore invalid and void. He presented the marriage record, 1871, and spoke for 15 minutes in the organized, confident manner of someone being paid by the argument. Price responded with the abandonment counterclaim, presenting the timeline. 7 years of absence, no court filings, no documented contact through official channels, no financial support of any kind across the entire period. Fetcher produced the letters. Price examined them and said, for the record, that he reserved the right to challenge their authenticity on the grounds of material condition inconsistent with claim dates, and then moved on because challenging them effectively required evidence he didn't have, and he was not going to waste the hearing on a fight he couldn't yet win. Cross took the stand. He was, as Evelyn had said, believable. That was the word. He was not theatrical. Theatrical men oversell themselves, and experienced judges notice. He was measured, clear, and consistently sorrowful. He spoke about Evelyn in the language of a man describing a woman he loved and had not understood, which was more damaging than cruelty would have been. He described her leaving as a shock and a grief. He described the subsequent years as a man bereft, searching, hoping. He described the letters as attempts to reach across a distance she had imposed. He said, with an expression of quiet pain that Silas had to admire on a purely technical level, that he had never stopped considering her his wife and never would. The room was very quiet during this. Silas watched the faces in the crowd and saw something he'd been afraid of. Not belief exactly, but uncertainty. The replacement of the simple story, bad husband, fleeing wife, was something more complicated, More like two versions of a reality that couldn't both be true, but both sounded plausible when you didn't know the specifics. He looked at Evelyn. She was watching Cross testify with an expression that had gone beyond the controlled one into something harder and more interior, like a person listening to a song they know is false, but cannot immediately disprove. Price cross-examined Cross for 30 minutes and made progress around the edges. The letter's addresses were inconsistent with where Evelyn had actually been during the claimed periods, which Price established through patient questioning. But Cross absorbed the pressure without breaking, adjusting his answers with the flexibility of someone who has practiced adjusting answers. When Cross stepped down, Fetcher called two men from Fallow Ridge, men Silas didn't know, who testified to Cross's good character and standing in the community, to his distress at Evelyn's disappearance, to the general impression that she had left without justification. Then Price called Thomas. The boy walked to the front of the room with the particular care of someone who knows people are watching and has decided not to let it matter. He was wearing his good shirt, which was clean and only slightly too short in the sleeves because he'd grown since winter. He stood before Judge Wick and answered Price's questions in the direct, unhurried way he'd developed over the past year. The voice of a boy who had been doing a man's work and had learned the man's economy of language. He described the ranch as it had been when Evelyn arrived: the sick cattle, the low woodpile, Millie's chest illness, the kitchen that hadn't been managed properly for months. He described what had changed. He described it with specificity rather than sentiment, which was more effective. The cattle weights, the fence repairs, the garden layout, Millie's recovery measured in weeks. He described Evelyn as a worker and as a person who had been, in his judgment, honest and consistent across the entire period of her employment. "She told us your father was dead," Price said, meaning Cross. "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "Do you know why she might have said that?" Fetcher objected. The boy wouldn't know her reasons. Wick sustained it. Price moved on. But the question had been placed in the room. Harold Granger testified briefly about Evelyn's character as he'd observed it through Silas's account. Hetterly said his piece about the livestock. Damon Reeves, to Silas's genuine surprise, testified to the improvement in the Creed household as he had observed it on his visits. And when Fetcher tried to redirect him into territory about Evelyn's reputation on arrival, Reeves said, with the precision of a man who works in documentation for a living, that reputation and observation were different categories of evidence, and he was only in a position to speak to the latter. Then Price said, "I'd like to call Evelyn Creed." The room shifted. People who had been still moved slightly. Cross at his table went very still in a different way, the stillness of controlled readiness. Evelyn stood up. She walked to the front of the room and stood before Judge Wick and did not look at Cross. She answered Price's early questions in the flat, direct tone she used for facts: her name, the duration of her first marriage, the date she left Fallow Ridge, the circumstances of her arrival in Harlan's Crossing. Then Price said, "Mrs. Creed, can you tell the court why you left your first husband?" The room was very quiet. Evelyn looked at Price for a moment. Then she looked at the room, not performing the looking, just doing it, letting her eyes go across the people who had been talking about her for 7 months. Martha Alderton from the Post, Francis Holt, the Reeveses, Harold Granger, Vernon Pyle, who had knocked her bundle into the mud in February. She looked at them, and then she looked at Judge Wick. "I left," she said, "because I was afraid that if I stayed, I would not survive it." The quiet became absolute. "Can you be specific?" Price said. She was still for a moment. Then, with a deliberateness that cost her something visible, he could see it, the decision being made in real time, she reached up to the collar of her dress. She unfastened the top buttons, not all of them, enough to pull the fabric off her left shoulder, and she turned slightly so that the room could see what she was showing Judge Wick: the shoulder and the upper arm, where the skin carried the record of things that had been done to it. Old marks, years past the healing, but clear enough. Clear enough that several people in the room made sounds they hadn't intended to make. She refastened her collar. "That's my left shoulder," she said. "My left wrist healed incorrectly after it was broken. There are other things I won't show in a public room, but I'll show them to the court privately if required." Judge Wick's face had not changed. He had seen difficult things in many hearings, but something around his eyes had tightened. "When did these injuries occur?" Price said. "Across 11 years of marriage," she said. At varying intervals. She paused. The pattern was consistent if the occasions varied. Did you report these injuries to any authority at the time? No, she said. Why not? Because the law in Fallow Ridge would have returned me to him, she said. Because I had no money and no family to go to. Because I had tried twice before to leave and been found and brought back. She said all of this with the same flatness she used for facts, because she had made a decision to say it as fact and not as appeal. And because I was afraid of exactly what is happening right now, that I would say it and not be believed. Fetcher cross-examined her for 20 minutes, and the cross-examination was aggressive in the way of a lawyer who knows the ground has shifted and is trying to recover it. He questioned her timeline, her characterization, the absence of any corroborating evidence at the time. He suggested that her account was constructed to serve her current legal position. She answered each question without losing the flatness. She did not embellish, did not become emotional, did not deviate from what she had said. The consistency of it was itself a kind of testimony. The sound of someone who is telling the same story because it happened the same way, not because they've rehearsed it into smoothness. Then, from the back of the room, a voice said, "Excuse me." Everyone turned. A woman was standing near the rear wall, elderly, with a bearing that was erect despite her age, and hands that gripped a wooden cane with some force. Silas didn't know her. He looked at Price, who shook his head slightly. Judge Wick looked at her. "This is a formal proceeding, ma'am," he said. "Do you have standing to address the court?" "I believe I do," she said. "My name is Nora Cross. I am Gideon's mother." The quality of silence in the room changed again. The way it changes when something entirely unexpected enters the space and everyone recalibrates at once. Gideon Cross was on his feet. "Your Honor," he said. "Sit down, Mr. Cross," Judge Wick said. He looked at the old woman. "You want to testify?" "I want to say something," she said. "Whether that constitutes testimony or not, I leave to you." Wick considered her for a moment. Then he said, "Come forward." She made her way through the room slowly, using the cane, and people shifted to let her pass. Cross remained standing until Fetcher pulled him back into his chair. The old woman came to the front of the room and stood there and looked at Judge Wick, and then, for a long moment, at her son. "I have known about this for a long time," she said. Her voice was old, but it was clear. "What he did in that house. I have known, and I have said nothing, because he is my son, and I told myself it wasn't my place, and I told myself she was difficult, and she provoked him, and I told myself a great many things that I knew were not true." She stopped. "I'm not going to tell myself those things anymore." Cross said, "Mother, I watched her come to my house," the old woman said, and she was still looking at her son, and her voice was level with the specific levelness of someone who has decided to say the true thing and will not be turned from it. With bruises she had tried to cover, and a wrist she said she'd hurt by accident, and I knew it wasn't an accident because I had seen the accident happen, and it was not one. She turned back to Judge Wick. "The letters he produced were written last month. I was in the room when he wrote 2 of them. I can describe the paper he used. I can describe the pen. I can tell you exactly what he said when he sealed them. The room was not quiet. Multiple conversations had broken out in the way conversations break out when something is shifted so completely that people cannot contain their reaction. Judge Wick brought his hand down on the desk twice, hard, and the conversations subsided. Fetcher was on his feet with objections, procedural objections, standing objections, the lawyer's version of throwing everything at a wall. Wick listened to the objections for a moment and then held up one hand. "I'll hear the witness," he said. Nora Cross testified for 15 minutes. She was precise, unhurried, and specific in the way of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has decided the carrying is over. She described 2 specific incidents she had witnessed at the Fallow Ridge house. She described the letters and the circumstances of their writing with the particularity that Price had said they'd need and hadn't been able to find. She described her son's character with the brutal accuracy of someone who loves a person and is no longer willing to protect them from themselves. When she was done, she made her way back through the room with the same slow dignity she'd come in with, and she did not look at her son again. Cross did not take the stand again. Fetcher consulted with him in a rapid undertone and then said, For the record, that the plaintiff rested. Judge Wick took 30 minutes. He came back into the room and sat down and arranged his papers and looked at the assembled people of Harlan's Crossing and the people who had come with Gideon Cross and said, without preamble, the claim challenging the validity of the marriage between Silas Creed and Evelyn Cross is denied. The evidence presented supports a finding of abandonment under territorial law, the plaintiff's documented absence of 7 years, the absence of legitimate contact attempts during that period, as established by the credible testimony of the plaintiff's own mother regarding the letter's provenance, and the pattern of conduct toward the respondent that the court finds consistent with the circumstances that precipitated her departure. He paused. The marriage between Silas Creed and Evelyn Cross, solemnized on the 10th of September, 1889, is recognized as valid and binding by this court. The prior marriage of record between Gideon Cross and Evelyn Cross is found to have been effectively abandoned by the plaintiff's conduct and is hereby void. He looked at Cross directly. Mr. Cross, the civil actions you have filed against Silas Creed are dismissed. I want to be very clear about the reason. The court finds these filings to be without merit and to have been undertaken as a mechanism of coercion rather than legitimate legal remedy. Should you bring further action in this territory against either Mr. or Mrs. Creed, I will look upon those filings with significant skepticism and will not hesitate to apply sanctions available to this court. He set down his papers. This proceeding is concluded. The room broke into sound. Silas didn't hear most of it. He was aware of it. The noise, the movement, people turning to each other, someone near the door saying something in a voice too loud. But it was peripheral. What was central was Evelyn, beside him, sitting very still in the way she went still when something interior was happening that she wasn't going to show immediately. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and gripped his once, tight, and then released it. They stood up. People in the room were making space, in the way people make space when they've suddenly recalibrated someone's position and feel the need to demonstrate the recalibration. Martha Alderton from the Post caught Silas's eye and gave him a nod that was an apology without the word. Hetterly put his hand out and Silas shook it. Harold Granger said, "Well," in a tone that covered a great deal of unsaid things. Cross was gone by the time Silas looked for him. He and Fetcher had moved through the side door of the land office before the noise of the room had properly started and the door was already closed. Nora Cross was still in the back of the room. Silas worked his way toward her through the crowd, and she watched him come with eyes that were dry and clear and exhausted. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mrs. Creed," she said, correcting herself, or correcting the name. He couldn't tell which. "How is she?" Silas looked back toward Evelyn, who was surrounded by people now. Frances Holt saying something to her with an expression of urgent sincerity. Damon Reeves nearby with a more restrained but evident renegotiation going on in his face. "I think she's all right," he said. "I think she's going to be all right." The old woman nodded. "I should have done that 12 years ago," she said. "I want you to know I know that." He didn't tell her it was all right because it wasn't entirely all right, and she hadn't asked to be absolved. She'd just stated a fact about herself. He respected that. "Thank you for doing it today," he said. She nodded again and turned and made her way out through the door with her cane, and the crowd parted for her, and then she was gone. He made his way back to Evelyn through the press of people. She was still in conversation with Frances Holt, and she looked at Silas over Frances's shoulder when he reached her, and her face did the thing it did when the management came down. Just her face, without the apparatus. He thought she might cry. He'd never seen her cry, not in 7 months. She didn't cry now. Her jaw tightened and her eyes were doing something complicated, and her hand found his arm and gripped it, and she turned back to Frances Holt and said something civil that ended the conversation, and then she looked at Silas. "Can we go home?" she said. "Yes," he said. They went out through the door into the September afternoon, which was ordinary and golden and without ceremony, and the wagon was tied where they'd left it, and the mules were waiting with the patient indifference of animals that don't keep track of human events. And Silas helped Evelyn up onto the bench and then climbed up himself and picked up the reins. They drove the first mile without speaking. The road was dry and the light came through the pines at a low afternoon angle that put long shadows across the track. The mules moved at their usual pace, unhurried, knowing the way home. "She didn't have to do that," Evelyn said finally. No, Silas said. She's his mother, Evelyn said. The complexity of that was in her voice. Not forgiveness exactly, not the absence of it either. Just the acknowledgement that human relationships were not simple even when the people in them did terrible things. She did it anyway, Silas said. Another mile of quiet. The ranch track came up on the right and the mules turned onto it without being told, knowing the way animals know their own places. Silas, Evelyn said. Yeah, he said. Thank you, she said. Not just for today, for... She stopped. She was not a woman who found these words easy either, which was one of the things he understood about her by now. For February, she said finally, for picking up the tin box. He thought about that for a moment. The alley mouth and the frozen mud and the three men and the woman going down on one knee and holding onto her bundle. Anyone would have, he said. They didn't, she said. He didn't have a response to that felt adequate, so he didn't try for one. He let it sit. The house came into view at the end of the track. The porch with its left-leaning post, the chimney smoke rising thin and straight, the kitchen garden fence neat and repaired, the apple trees in the late afternoon light carrying their heavy freight of fruit that was almost ready. Thomas was at the fence of the cattle pen, doing the evening count by habit, and he looked up when the wagon came down the track, and he must have read something in the way they were sitting or the pace they were driving because he started toward the gate without waiting to be called. Millie came off the porch at a run. She didn't ask anything. She ran to the wagon before it had fully stopped, and Silas caught her as she launched herself upward, 6 years old in October and still small enough to carry. And she wrapped her arms around his neck, and then immediately reached sideways for Evelyn, bridging them both, one arm on each of them with the proprietary grip of a child who has decided who belongs to her and is not confused about it. I counted all the chickens, Millie announced. Twice. Thomas said I probably miscounted the first time, but I didn't. That sounds right, Evelyn said. Her voice was slightly unsteady, but Millie didn't notice. How many? Silas asked. 14, Millie said. Both times. Exactly. Good, Silas said. He looked at Evelyn over the top of Millie's head. She was looking back at him, and the September light was on her face, and she was not performing any particular expression, just sitting there with his daughter's arm around her neck in the cooling afternoon. And she looked, not happy exactly, because happy was too simple, and nothing that had happened was simple, but something that was in the direction of peace. The beginning of it, the first edge of a thing that might become it, given time. Thomas reached the wagon and looked up at them. How did it go? He said. It went well, Silas said. Thomas nodded once, the nod of a boy who has already moved forward to the practical implications. The notch-eared cow's been favoring her foot again, he said. Left front. I'll look at it in the morning, Silas said. I looked at it already, Thomas said. Couldn't find anything. Might just be the ground hardness. Good thinking, Silas said. We'll keep an eye on it. Thomas nodded and went back toward the cattle pen to finish what he'd been doing, because there was always something to finish, and he had learned that finishing things mattered regardless of what else had happened in the day. Silas watched him go and thought about the boy he'd been in February. The one carrying too much? The one who'd been managing this household by sheer force of his 11 years and his sense of responsibility. And the boy he was now, still responsible, still careful, but less alone in it. Less like the only one holding the whole thing up. He climbed down from the wagon and lifted Millie down and led the mules toward the barn, and behind him he heard Evelyn and June talking. June had come out from somewhere and was asking about the hearing with the direct curiosity she applied to everything. And the evening sounds of Creed's Hollow were ordinary and settling and completely familiar. He unhitched the mules and led them to their stalls, and stood in the barn in the half-dark for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch in the late afternoon, the cattle settling in the pen, the hens in the coop, the creak of the house, and the voices coming from it. He thought about what Evelyn had said in the wagon, for February, for picking up the tin box. He thought about the alley and the mud, and the woman with the bundle, and the expression of endurance that had been on her face, the expression of someone who had been through the hard things so many times that hard had become their baseline expectation of the world. And he thought about the expression that had been on her face this afternoon, over Millie's arm, in the September light. They were not the same expression. That, he thought, was what 7 months looked like. What one person choosing to see another person really see them and not look away from the scene. That was what it looked like. He went back out into the evening and toward the house, and the light was going low and gold, and the smoke was rising from the chimney because someone had already started the supper fire, and everything that needed doing still needed doing. He went in. Gideon Cross left Harlan's Crossing the morning after the hearing. Nobody saw him go. He was simply there the night before, his horse tied outside the less respectable saloon, his presence a weight in the town the way certain presences are, felt without being seen. And then in the morning he was not there, and his horse was not there, and Fetcher was not there, and the only evidence that any of them had existed was the set of legal filings in Damon Reeves's land office, and the memory of what had happened in the room the day before, which was the kind of memory that stays. Silas heard about it from Harold Granger on a supply run that Monday. Harold said it the way people say things when they're reporting information, but also processing it themselves. Looks like he cleared out, and then looked at Silas with an expression that was attempting, imperfectly, to encompass everything Harold had thought and said and done over the past 7 months and arrive somewhere honest about it. "I owe you an apology," Harold said. He said it quickly, the way men say things they've been building up to and need to get out before they reconsider. "I told you she was trouble, back in February. I said that." "You did," Silas said. "I was wrong," Harold said. Silas picked up the sack of cornmeal and set it in the wagon bed. "You were going on what you had," he said. "Same as most people." "That's generous of you," Harold said. "It's accurate," Silas said. "There's a difference." He said it without irritation, because he'd arrived, somewhere in the days since the hearing, at a position on the town of Harlan's Crossing that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, more like understanding, which was harder than either. People in isolated places built their judgments from limited materials. They mistook unfamiliarity for danger because sometimes unfamiliarity was danger, and they'd learned that the hard way and over-applied the lesson. That didn't make what they'd done to Evelyn right. It just made it human, which was its own kind of complicated. He drove home with the supplies and told Evelyn that Cross was gone, and she received the information the way she received most things. Still, processing, not performing a reaction. She was at the kitchen counter when he told her, peeling potatoes, and her hand slowed for a moment and then continued. "Do you believe it?" she said. "That he's actually gone?" "I think the judge's warning landed," Silas said. "Wick has a reputation in this territory. Cross is careful about which fights he can win." "He's careful about everything," she said. "That's what I said before." "I know," Silas said. But Price filed a full record copy with the territorial court in the county seat. Everything that happened in that room is documented, including his mother's testimony. If he comes back and tries anything, there's a paper trail that makes his position worse every time he moves. He paused. He knows that. He'll look for easier ground somewhere else. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands had gone still on the potato and the peeling knife. "I've been waiting for him to come back since I was 24 years old," she said. "Every town I was in, every time I heard a horse on the road, every time someone mentioned Fallow Ridge." She set the knife down. "I don't know what it feels like to stop waiting." He didn't have a simple answer to that, because there wasn't one. Some fears don't dissolve when the threat leaves. They've been resident too long. They've made themselves at home in the architecture of a person, and they don't vacate just because the occasion for them has passed. He knew that from his own experience, the particular way grief had installed itself after Clara died, present in the small hours of the morning, even now, not as sharp as it had been, but still there, changed in quality rather than gone. "Probably feels like regular days for a while," he said. "And then one day you realize you forgot to wait." She looked at him. Then she picked up the knife and went back to the potatoes. "That's either reassuring or depressing," she said. "Probably both," he said. She almost smiled. October came in with a cold that was honest about its intentions, and the apple harvest came with it. Clara's 4 trees had produced more than Silas could remember them producing before. Heavy, dense fruit that needed to come down in the first week before the hard frost could split them. Evelyn organized the picking the way she organized everything, with practical attention to what needed doing and who was suited to do it. Thomas on the ladder, June catching and bagging with meticulous care, Millie carrying the smaller bags to the barn because she had insisted on a job, and that was the one that best matched her current physical situation. Silas picked alongside them. It took the better part of 2 days. By the end of the first evening, his shoulders ached in the specific way of overhead work sustained too long, and he sat on the porch after supper and worked at the knot in his right shoulder with 2 fingers and watched the sky go dark and thought about Clara planting those trees in the 3rd year of the ranch, when everything was still new, and the future seemed to be mostly something you built toward. He hadn't thought about her that way in a while, not in the future tense, not in the active sense. More often he thought about her in the completed sense, the way you think about things that have their full shape and will not add to themselves anymore. He thought about her the way he thought about the apple trees, something she had planted, something that had roots in the ground that she had put there, something that was still growing even now, even after. He didn't think that was disloyal. He thought it was disloyal, for a while. He'd thought all kinds of things about himself that had turned out to be more severe than accurate. Evelyn came out onto the porch and handed him a cup of coffee and sat in the other chair, and the night air smelled like apples and cut grass, and the first edge of wood smoke from the chimney. "Thomas asked me something today," she said. "What did he ask?" "He asked whether I was going to stay." She said it straight, without build-up. "Permanently." He said he wanted to know because he'd been thinking about it and he wanted to know. Silas looked at his coffee. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes," she said, "if that was all right." He looked at her. The porch light was the lantern he'd hung on the left post, which was the tilted one, and it swung slightly in the evening air and put the light in motion across her face. "It's more than all right," he said. She nodded, accepting this, and looked out at the dark pasture. He said, "Good," she said. And then he went back to what he was doing, just like that. "That's Thomas," Silas said. "I know," she said. "I've learned that." A quiet settled between them, but it was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. Across the yard, the cattle were invisible in the dark but audible, the soft movements and occasional sounds that told you the herd was settled and the night was going normally. The creek was running again after the dry summer, low but steady, its sound a constant underneath everything else. "What about you?" he said, after a while. "Are you all right? Not the ranch, not the legal situation. You." She considered the question in the way she considered things that required honest answers rather than practical ones. "I'm working on it," she said. "I don't know how to be settled. I've been moving or preparing to move for so long that staying in one place feels like a thing I have to practice." She paused. "But I want to practice it. That's different from before. Before I was always looking at the road." "And now?" he said. She looked at the dark outline of the apple trees against the slightly lighter sky. "Now I'm looking at the trees," she said. The town's recalibration was imperfect and ongoing, which was the nature of recalibration. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen clean. People who had been hostile to Evelyn did not wake up the day after the hearing with their opinions simply reversed. They woke up with the discomfort of having held an opinion that had been demonstrated wrong, and that discomfort expressed itself in different ways. Some of them, like Martha Alderton, moved toward direct acknowledgement. Martha stopped Evelyn outside the post office in the 3rd week of October and said, with the compressed efficiency of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it and then be done with it, "I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." Evelyn had said, "Thank you," and that had been the end of it, both of them moving on because neither one was the type to make more of a moment than the moment required. Some of them were quieter about it. Frances Holt, who began stopping by the ranch more regularly on the thin pretense of borrowing things or returning things, and whose actual purpose seemed to be proximity, as if nearness to Evelyn was a way of correcting the distance she'd previously imposed. Eleanor Reeves sent a jar of preserved peaches to the ranch without a note, which Evelyn held in her hands for a moment when Silas brought it in, and then set it on the shelf and said nothing, and later used it to make a cobbler that the children ate with the enthusiasm of people who do not track the complicated social history of food. Damon Reeves was the most interesting case. He came to the ranch 3 weeks after the hearing, in the early afternoon, and sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and talked to Silas and Evelyn with the specific awkwardness of a man who is accustomed to being in authority and has recently been on the wrong side of something and is not sure how to hold himself now. He said that the community had discussed the situation, meaning, Silas understood, the informal body of voices that constituted Harlan's Crossing's self-governance, and that there was a general feeling that the Creed Ranch should be given the benefit of the doubt going forward on any matters involving community cooperation, which was a careful way of withdrawing the threat about the cattle market that he'd made in August. "That's decent of you," Silas said. "It's the least we could do," Reeves said. He looked at Evelyn. "The least. I want to be clear that I know that." Evelyn looked at him with an expression that was not warm but was not cold either, something neutral and willing to move forward. "All right," she said. "I appreciate you saying it." It wasn't the end of things between Evelyn and Harlan's Crossing. She was not, overnight, a beloved figure in the community. The reputation that had preceded her had been replaced by a different reputation, more complex, harder to dismiss. But reputation is not the same as relationship, and relationship takes time in ways that court rulings can't shortcut. She was known now, or beginning to be. Seen, or beginning to be seen. That was enough to work with. Vernon Pyle never came to the ranch. He never said anything directly. But one afternoon in November, Silas encountered him outside the hardware store in Harlan's Crossing, and Pyle looked at him for a moment with an expression that was working at something, and then he said, "Your wife did well up there, standing her ground." He said it quickly and then went into the hardware store, and Silas stood on the boardwalk and thought that that was probably the most Pyle was capable of, and decided it was enough. November brought the cold for real, not the polite cold of October, but the honest frontier cold that settled into the valley and stayed. The cattle needed more management, the woodpile needed constant attention, and the house needed the kind of winterizing that Silas had let slide the previous year because he hadn't had the time or the hands. This year, he had both. He and Evelyn and Thomas spent a week in November going through the house systematically, resealing the window frames where the caulking had dried and cracked, adding insulation to the root cellar door, rehanging the kitchen door that had been dropping on its hinges since August. Thomas had grown another half-inch since September and was beginning to have the useful size of a boy turning toward a young man, and he carried himself differently than he had in February. Not more confidently exactly, but less effortfully. The effort of being the only capable person in the house had been wearing on him in ways that Silas hadn't fully recognized until the wearing eased. One evening during that week, Silas heard something from the girl's bedroom that stopped him in the hallway. Millie's voice, asking, "Are you my mama now?" A pause that lasted long enough to be significant. Evelyn's voice, "What do you think?" "I think yes," Millie said, with the decisive authority of someone who has considered the question thoroughly and arrived at a conclusion. "June says you're a stepmother, but that sounds like a different thing." "It's a kind of mother," Evelyn said. "The step part just means we came to it a different way than the usual way." "What's the usual way?" Millie asked. "I'd have been there from the start," Evelyn said, "from when you were born." Millie processed this. "But you weren't," she said. "No," Evelyn said, "I wasn't." "Do you wish you were?" Another pause. Silas stood very still in the hallway. "Yes," Evelyn said quietly. "I think I do." He heard Millie shift in the bed, the particular sound of a small child resettling. "That's okay," Millie said, with the enormous generosity of a child who has decided a matter is closed. "You're here now." Silas went back down the hallway to the kitchen and sat down and put his hands flat on the table and stayed there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with it. He thought, "You're here now." He thought about how much weight a simple sentence could carry when the person saying it was 6 years old and meant it entirely. The question of what June and Millie called Evelyn resolved itself without anyone engineering the resolution, which was the way the best things seemed to happen at Creed's Hollow. Not from a decision or a plan, but from the accumulation of ordinary days until the ordinary became something more. Millie had been calling her mama since sometime in October, shifting to it from Evelyn so gradually that nobody could identify the exact day it happened. June held out longer, not from resistance, but from the